He was a tough guy fighter pilot from Louisiana who had little tolerance for those he thought foolish, even when they were his superior officers. He resigned his commission 4 years before the United States entered World War II. He wanted to help the embattled Chinese defend themselves. Convinced that the massive Japanese forces could be defeated in China by 100 good pilots in 100 good planes, he got secret permission and funding from President Franklin Roosevelt to set up a freelance American Air Force in China. His group, which became known as the Flying Tigers, shot down 15 Japanese planes for every plane it lost. He is Claire Chennault, and he is a legend of air power. Claire Lee Chennault was born in Commerce, Texas in 1890, according to his official Air Force biography, or 1893, according to recent scholarly research. He was raised in tiny, waterproof Louisiana and spent his boyhood hunting, fishing, and learning self-reliance in the forests and bayous that surrounded his home. Unlike most of his peers, he attended and graduated from college. He might have spent his life as a teacher, except that World War I intervened. Swept up in the patriotic fervor of the times, Chennault enlisted in the Army.
Had an interest in flying, joined the Army during the First World War, but didn't really get to see any combat and didn't even become a pilot until after the war. So he became a pilot, but too late to participate in World War I.
He got his wings in 1919 and started his career in one of the hardest periods in American military history. The war was over, and the overwhelming sentiment of the United States was to disengage from the world. Military budgets plummeted to nearly nothing, and the few officers not mustered out spent all of their time trying to justify their paychecks to a disinterested public.
He believed in aviation, and at that time it was not a popular thing because the Air Force was under the Army, and it was not an Air Force.
Military pilots became little more than officially sanctioned barnstormers, traveling around the country and risking their lives to convince the public and their own commanders that aviation had a future. Chennault's contribution was 3 men and a trapeze, the first Air Corps flight demonstration team.
They flew their airplanes tied together with ropes and did loops and all kinds of aerobatics that way.
He actually used it in a way to promote his concept of pursuit and his policies on how air power should be used.
But no matter how many distance and speed records the flyers broke, no matter how many ships they sank or precise maneuvers they perfected, the fact remained that the generation in command had come of age on horseback. They believed that air-to-air combat was a gimmick destined for irrelevance, and only grudgingly accepted that large bombers might have a place in battle. Chennault took every opportunity to argue the case for fighters, saying that air superiority was the most important factor in modern battle. Chennault advocated a concept he called defensive pursuit, the interception of bombers by small fighters willing to venture out over enemy territory.
Defensive pursuit basically means keeping the enemy away from your own soil. You fly out and intercept them before they get to you. You take the fight along with the bombers to escort them into hostile territories.
In a time of extremely tight budgets, the Army Air Corps had decided to concentrate on bombers. Chennault, then only a major, took over as the Army's Chief of Pursuit Training in 1936 and made defensive pursuit the centerpiece of fighter pilot training. In effect, he was teaching that official Air Corps doctrine was wrong.
In his tactical lectures, you could tell that the guy had been there and done that, you know. He just, he was the kind of guy that just exuded confidence. That you could.
He tended to butt heads with the people around him, particularly his superiors. If he came up with what he thought was a good theory, then he thought that that's a theory that they should use, whether or not they thought it was a theory they should use or not. And he didn't back down, and that's not the way to get ahead in the military.
The Army let him get away with it for barely more than a year. In 1937, they declared Chennault medically unfit for service. None of the medical problems cited in Chennault's discharge was new. His lungs were shot from his 2 packs a day smoking habit, and his hearing had been damaged by years of flying in open cockpit aircraft. The Army had known both of those things for years, but his real affliction was defensive pursuit.
He got in a lot of trouble. In fact, that's why they retired him from the Air Force, because he was advocating developing more fighters and fighter tactics, and the Army Air Corps was interested in getting to be a separate service, you know, a separate Air Force. So they were concentrating on strategic bombing. They thought that was the way to go. And they didn't want to hear that fighters could shoot down bombers and bombers needed escort and all that stuff.
In a fit of pique worthy of a petulant teenager, Chennault packed his bags and headed for China, as far away from his tormentors as he could get. The Japanese had invaded. Chennault saw the war as both an adventure and a chance to prove his rivals wrong about defensive pursuit. And prove them wrong he did. The Japanese used large, slow bombers to destroy Chinese cities and troop concentrations. Because the Chinese had no Air Force to speak of, the Japanese didn't bother with fighter cover.
The Japanese, who had been basically chewing on the Chinese heels for 40 years at that point, were basically having free reign of the air and destroying Chinese towns, industrial facilities, population centers, and they really had no defense. So Chennault was able to come over and advise the Generalissimo at that time how to defend against them.
Chennault arrived in China and announced that if he could get 100 pilots and 100 good fighter planes, he could defeat the Japanese using the defensive pursuit technique the Army command had rejected. One of the people Chennault buttonholed on the subject was Generalissimo Chaing-kai Shek, the supreme commander of the Chinese military. Chiang was desperate enough to try what the American conservative military had rejected. He put Chennault to work, assembling a small, fast air force that could defeat the Japanese bombers. Claire Chennault, retired involuntarily from the Army Air Corps, arrived in China armed with his belief that a few good planes and pilots could turn the tide in the war. What he found appalled him. The Chinese Air Force was still flying biplanes, and their pilots were nearly untrained. In a single day, Chennault watched 5 supposedly combat-ready pilots crash on routine landings or takeoffs. He knew the job he had volunteered to do was bigger than he had imagined.
When he went to China, he only intended to stay for 3 months. But then, of course, he saw the Japanese, the bombing Shanghai and the massacre in Nanjing, and then the Chinese people sort of urged him to stay on.
Chennault, through friends, appealed to President Roosevelt for permission to recruit American pilots to fight in China. Roosevelt, looking for politically manageable ways to contribute to the war, quickly approved the project. Chennault's first effort, the 14th Volunteer Squadron, was a nearly complete failure. He recruited the conveniently available pilots, not the most qualified. He outfitted his hard-drinking mercenaries with the only aircraft available, outdated Chinese fighters. After a few missions, it was clear even to Chennault that he would have to start over. The Japanese kept winning, bombing Chinese cities at will and inflicting horrible tortures on conquered civilian populations. Chennault knew that if he was going to make a difference in the war, And if he was going to prove that defensive pursuit had a future in aviation, he needed good planes and good pilots. And that meant going back to the United States. He told Chaing-kai Shek that his only hope was to buy new planes and man them with competent pilots recruited from the United States. Chiang was by nature suspicious of Westerners, but Chennault was one of only a handful of Westerners who seemed to care about the Chinese, and that commitment won the Generalissimo's trust.
I think it was a personality thing. Chaing-kai Shek was, I think, of an awe-type relationship with Chennault, and their personalities just seemed to mesh. And I think that he appreciated the qualities in Chennault that perhaps the U.S. military hadn't appreciated up to that point.
In 1940, Chiang dispatched his brother-in-law and Chennault to Washington. With war building around the world and Lend-Lease orders piling up in American factories, just finding the aircraft was a challenge. But in Washington, Chennault tracked down a shipment of P-40s that had been rejected by the British.
The P-40 in those days was really not ready for combat. It didn't have bulletproof tanks, it didn't have armor plate, it didn't have a lot of equipment in it that it needed if you're really going to fight. Our guns would fire and the airplane would fly, but there were many changes made to the P-40 before we actually started combat in it.
No matter, the planes were available. Chennault took his Chinese escort to Bowling Field for a demonstration. Johnny Allison, then a young Air Corps pilot, put a P-40 through its paces for the Chinese delegation.
We got in out of the wind, and the Chinese began to excitedly talk to General Chennault, and that's when one of them said to General Chennault, well, what we need is 100 of those airplanes. And that's when Chennault looked at the general and he said, no, that's not what you need. And he tapped me on the chest. He said, you need 100 of those.
Chennault got his planes and recruited his pilots and headed back to China to set up his American volunteer group.
Well, the AVG was a way to bring the American military under the guise of a civilian force into the war in China against the Japanese before we had really declared war on the Japanese.
Chiang got his Air Force. Roosevelt got a war that would tie up more than 1 million Japanese troops. And Chennault got a chance to prove himself. Chennault's flyers did not start out as an elite. Many had flown nothing but basic trainers, and others were more interested in flying airliners than fighters. But lured by the money, $600 a month, plus a bounty for any Japanese plane shot down, and the adventure of fighting in exotic China, they signed up.
Well, my attraction, I'd heard Daddy talk about that part of the world, you know, and it's just kind of intriguing.
It took a long time for Chennault's pilots, planes, and support personnel to make their way to China. As they trickled in, Chennault drilled them mercilessly. He was not about to send his men into battle as ill-prepared as the Chinese. Along with all the standard flight training, he drilled them on the architecture of Japanese aircraft, so the pilots would know the Japanese weak point. But mostly, he trained them in his own tactical theory, preparing them to disrupt the Japanese bombers by intercepting them before they reached their targets.
We were better trained in one way. The Japanese pilots, the only weakness I saw as far as handling an airplane and everything, the Japanese were superb. They really were good. But they were so regimented that once you break up any plan that they have, they don't have the capacity to accommodate to new situation. And that was the weakness I saw in them.
It was during this period that the American volunteer group started painting their planes with fiercely bared teeth. The design was cribbed from photos of fighters in an Indian magazine. The paint job wasn't anything the AVG took special note of. In fact, part of Chennault's strategy was to repaint the planes almost every mission, so the Japanese would be fooled into thinking there were more Americans in China than there really were. While Jimmy Doolittle's Raiders usually get credit for striking the first American blow on Japan, in fact, it was the American Volunteer Group. On December 20th, 1941, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Chennault sent 2 AVG squadrons to attack a flight of 10 Japanese bombers near the city of Kunming. It was the first application of Chennault's strategy of defensive pursuit. The Americans, far from home and farther out of the limelight, shot down 3 or 4 of the bombers, accounts vary, and lost only a single P-40, which ran out of gas and crash-landed.
Up to that point, the Japanese had been allowed to just basically bomb at will anywhere they wanted to in China. So it did kind of draw a line in the sand and keep the Japanese at bay.
It wasn't long before word trickled back to the American public about the American Volunteer Group. The early months of the war were difficult for the United States, with few victories to celebrate. In that environment, the AVG made great press. Dubbed the Flying Tigers by reporters, they were a small group of renegade flyers under the command of a maverick officer. Volunteers all, they fought not for glory but for good, and became real-life cowboys fighting real-life Indians. The Flying Tigers, who did not refer to themselves by that name, quickly captured the imagination of the public.
You know, they were kind of the people that you wanted on your side. You didn't want them on the other side against you. And I think that pretty much sums up Chennault's personality and probably his whole career. You know, he was a success because he had the right ideas and he pressed it.
Chennault's obsession with training and his doctrine of defensive pursuit were amazingly successful. After a string of stunning defeats, the Japanese were forced to transfer hundreds of fighter aircraft to China. While that reduced the number of fighters in other theaters, it posed a problem for Chennault. Despite all the great press, he commanded a remarkably small force. And despite their great record, they were flying P-40s, which were already outdated. The Japanese arrived with faster, lighter, more maneuverable fighters and pilots who were already battle-tested. The only way for the Tigers to survive was to maintain rigid discipline and follow Chennault's tactics without fail. They hit and ran, swooping down from out of the sun, blowing a path through the Japanese formations without ever slowing down. The Japanese didn't have time to react before the Americans were gone.
But we just did high-speed passes, fired at them, pulled out, and came back again and tried to fire on them again. We didn't try to get in a turn with them because you couldn't turn with them.
Chennault's volunteers struck so quickly and in so many places, the Japanese intelligence concluded that Chennault had several hundred more planes than he really had. In fact, Chennault never had more than 100 Flying Tigers, and most of the time, the number was closer to 60.
Chennault did use the tactics that guerrilla commanders use, but no, we were a regular Air Force fighting also a well-trained Japanese Air Force. But if you were above them and you used the strong points of our aircraft and exploited the weak points of the Japanese airplanes, we had a superior situation, and that is the reason that actually the AVG shot down hundreds of airplanes with the loss of very few of our own.
For 6 months, Chennault's Tigers hit and ran against Japanese bombers. They shot down, by some accounts, nearly 300 Japanese aircraft, while suffering only 16 pilots either killed or captured. They were massively successful, flying Chennault's way.
All of the pilots admired General Chennault, and all of us listened to him. And he was really an outstanding leader.
In 1942, the regular Army arrived to take over. When the Flying Tigers became the 14th Air Force, most of Chennault's pilots decided not to enlist. But Chennault, convinced that he had proven himself and promised command of the 14th, stayed on.
At that time, he was pretty much running his own show, and he got along with the Chinese leadership, did some marvelous things as far as tactics goes, and he was the right person at that time. After we declared war and the AVG went away, you could make a case that he might not have been the right guy at that point.
He gave very inspiring talks to us, and but we were motivated more by the people that he had trained, because we were with them all the time, you know, the leaders like Tex Hill and other people that had been with him earlier, because we just didn't get to see him that much because he had bombers and all sorts of stuff to be in charge of. But we had the greatest respect and admiration for him. We followed his tactics rigorously.
The argument Chennault had been having with the Army for almost 20 years resumed almost immediately. General Joseph Stilwell, Chennault's new commander, ordered Chennault to concentrate on ground support, a mission he detested. "It's the man in the trenches who will win the war," Stilwell told Chennault at one of their first meetings. "Damn it, Stilwell," Chennault snarled back, "there are no trenches."
He was in all kinds of fights with General Stilwell, who had the whole theater. Stilwell didn't like aviation very much and didn't think much of it, and so they didn't see eye to eye.
Morale among the flyers plummeted, and as it fell, the amount of noise Chennault made about his woes increased. He eventually succeeded in getting Stilwell removed from command, a victory that derailed any hope Chennault had of fitting in with his regular Army commanders. In fact, his dedication to the Chinese caused some back in Washington to wonder whether he had switched his loyalties from the United States to Chiang's China. In 1945, with the Germans surrendered and the Japanese all but defeated, Hap Arnold gave Chennault the option of resigning or being demoted and fired. Chennault was on the flight back to the United States when word came through that the Japanese had surrendered.
In a way, he was punished for his success, but probably more to the point, he was being punished for some personality traits that his superiors perceived in him.
Chennault didn't stay away from China for long. In 1946, he returned, again as a civilian, to set up civil air transport. Supposedly a civilian airline, it later became a cover for an enormous CIA logistical operation, and years later reappeared in Vietnam as Air America. Chennault returned to the United States once and for all in 1950. His doctrine of defensive pursuit had become the status quo. Nonetheless, it wasn't until 1958 that the Air Force admitted that it might have been wrong about Chennault. On July 18, 1958, the Air Force promoted him to Lieutenant General. He died 9 days later.